Why don't we jump in? If folks want to drop their names and affiliations and where you're at in the chat, that'd be great to get a sense of who's in the room today. My name's Chantel Meek. I'm the founding executive director of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University. And I'm super excited to be here with my dear friends and colleagues to talk about new work on dual language education that we recently published. So why don't we jump in and get started? If you can go to the next slide. So right at the top, we want to just give a huge shout out and thank you to our funders who supported this work, which was the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, as well as the Heisen-Simons Foundation, who's the core CEP funder. Without their support, these are ideas that we've been wanting to implement and work on for years and years and years. And so without that support, it would not have been possible. So huge thank you to the funders. Go to our next slide, please. So we have a great panel and lineup today. We're going to be talking about dual language education, both the access side of the house and the quality side of the house. With my esteemed colleagues and fellow panelists, we have Dr. Sigrid Sotoboyken, who is the Director of Language Justice and Learning Equity at the Children's Equity Project at ASU, Dr. Connor Williams, who's a Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation, and Mrs. Gladys Montes, who's the former Executive Director of the United Way Center of Excellence in Early Education in Miami, to talk to us a little bit about implementation and what this all looks like in the real world. Next slide. So a couple years, the Children's Equity Project and the Century Foundation have partnered to do a whole lot of work on dual language education and on bilingualism. We've published these 4 reports together during that time to look at a whole range of issues, including all of the many rich benefits of bilingualism and biliteracy, to look at access in dual language education, which my colleague, Dr. Williams, will speak a little bit about, and to develop a set of briefs on what quality looks like in dual language education across the early years and the early grades. And my colleague, Dr. Sotoboyken, will lead us through that in a bit. So if we go to the next slide, I want to take a step back and we're going to reflect on this over the course of the webinar. But I'd be remiss if I didn't share the why, right? And a lot of the motivation for this work. We're gonna talk about it now and throughout. But really, I'm Mexican American, grew up bilingual in a very bilingual community in a small border town in southern Arizona. I'm now back in Arizona after being away for some time, raising my own kids bilingually in dual language and Spanish immersion programs. And in this richly bilingual community where I grew up, right, there were no formal dual language public schools. Education was really exclusively in English. But it turns out that there's a lot of young kids in the United States who speak languages other than or in addition to English. In fact, we know that about 1/3 of the young child population are emergent bilinguals. And by the time we get to K-12 settings, about 11% of the K-12 population is classified as English learners in that group. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a really good thing, right? Because there is a really long and robust body of evidence that shows that bilingualism is associated with a host of really positive outcomes across lots of different domains. Across cognitive development, there's a whole body of baby brain research that really looks at the benefits of being exposed to more than one language and how that's associated with a number of different executive functions and cognitive development pieces. Academically, we'll talk about in the next slide, but how exposure and access to dual language education in more than one language, is also associated with a number of positive benefits, social, emotionally, culturally, and even economically down the road, as we know that the labor market, right, there is huge benefits in this connected world economy, right, to be bilingual, multilingual, biliterate, multiliterate. Next slide, please. And it turns out that the best way to nurture all of this linguistic beauty and diversity in our young kids is to offer access to dual language educational opportunities. And so we're going to go through what that means and what that looks like, informed by all of the work that folks on this call and many other folks have been engaged in. But we know that access to dual language education is more effective, hands down. We need to stop even comparing them because we already know this, right? To programs that prioritize English only or certain variations of that type of model. Our work really spanned the infant, toddler through elementary space, really looking at what infant, toddler childcare looks like with the dual language approach, really looking at preschool settings and what dual language education looks like for that age range of kids, and then going all the way through the early elementary years where we start really building early literacy development and so on, and looking at what that looks like there. So again, we know the answer to this question. We know that the most effective model and approach is really dual language instruction. And there's a lot of research to support that we would invite you all to check out in more depth in the brief. Next slide, please. And all of that research leads me to the roots of this project, right? That really builds on decades of work from so many people across the nation over a long period of time. And so here we have a basic set of facts, right? We have linguistic diversity in this nation. We have lots of different languages spoken and lots of different kids and families who are speaking a rich array of languages at home. We know, number two, that bilingualism is good for lots of reasons, right? Identity development, social, emotional, family connections, as well as the cognitive stuff, as well as the academic stuff, as well as the economic stuff later on. We know dual language education harnesses that bilingualism and that early biliteracy in the best way. And we also know, I think it is really important to say, that we can't have equal educational opportunities without dual language education for our English learners, especially as we transition into the K-12 settings and we have laws that require equal education opportunities, right? So bilingual learning fundamentally enables access to the base curriculum for these kids. And so it's really not a matter of enrichment, it's a matter of basic educational access and equal educational access for a large swath of kids in this country. And still, right, despite all those benefits, despite all of those long-term outcomes we know, despite the fact that it really does make or break a child's early access to education, period, we deny these opportunities. We have very little access across the country, very few guidelines and operationalization of how to do dual language education well across these various age grades and during this across the different age spans. And we have still a lot of myths and racist ideologies that remain present in policy and programmatic decision-making today, including the most pervasive one that we know of, and also the most wrong one, that English immersion is the way. So we haven't made as much progress as we should have made, but we are hopeful that the pieces that we've published together and that we'll continue to work on with a large group and collection and network of colleagues that have participated in this work with us, are some of the pieces to move us forward, right? An understanding of who has access and who needs access, one, an operationalization of how to do it well, right? We need to stop asking again whether various iterations of English dominant models are better or worse than bilingual, because it is just a fundamental right? If we all agree that it is a right and that dual language and bilingual learning opportunities enable equal access, then it is on us and the onus on us to figure out how to do it well. So with that, let's get into the data, into the research of what we found, and then we'll hear from Gladys a little bit more about implementation and what this looks like in the real world. And then we'll have a panel discussion after that. So I am going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Connor Williams.
Hey, thanks so much, Chantel. And we can go right to the next slide. This is about the data that we found in our report, the first one, ensuring equitable access to dual language immersion programs. My motivation for this was that my children attend Title I dual language immersion schools in Washington, D.C. And the pace at which they began to gentrify as we were there was stunning to me. I wrote a piece about it for The Atlantic that went modestly viral, as much as a piece on dual language immersion can go viral on the internet. Uh, and it got me fascinated by whether really that was clearly happening in my kids' school and in the broader DC region, but it wasn't obvious that anybody had studied this at scale. So next slide, this is what we were trying to do. So for the last couple of years, next slide, please. For the last couple of years, we've been building this database to get to capture who goes to dual language immersion where, and of course, as much as we can across the country. This slide here captures what we were really trying to measure, because as it turns out, one of the things we discovered is that the challenge of equitable access is very much at this intersection of these two very clearly good things. Multilingualism is a good thing. It's the same. I have a 5-year-old. It's like good the way that dinosaurs are good. 2 dinosaurs are better than 1. 2 cookies are better than 1. 2 languages are better than 1. It's just a thing you can have more of. It's a lovely opportunity to be multilingual is a positive good. And so multilingualism for all is a totally appropriate goal for anyone, including for a whole system. The challenge, as Chantal said, is that we have a public education system which is riven with bias against historically marginalized kids who are marginalized on the facts of their languages that they speak, their race, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, then their nativity or their parents' nativity, whether they are immigrants or children of immigrants. And so that means that if we try this equality mindset where we want everybody to get a language, and then we have this system that assigns access to that good thing, which is scarce, as it turns out, in K-12 and in early ed, it filters it through these inequitable systems that we have. Well, it turns out the privileged get more of it. So one of the things that we know, as you heard already, is there's this clear research base that adding, if we just speak personally here, adding Welsh, my wife's mother tongue, or Spanish to my white English dominant upper middle class kids is an enrichment thing. It's great. It's wonderful. It's exciting. It's good for them, and it helps them along. It is not essential to their academic success. It's not essential to their connections to their family. They'll be fine whether they have that or not. Supporting the multilingualism of a lower income Spanish dominant English learning or dual language learning kid in early ed or in K-12 education, the research is clear that the best way to support those children is to maintain, develop, and celebrate their multilingualism. The challenge that we have, though, is that the absolute best way to do it is in a linguistically diverse setting, meaning if you take Spanish dominant kids or Korean dominant kids or Mandarin dominant kids, Cantonese dominant kids, any non-English language dominant children, and put them into a 2-way dual immersion program with an equal number or share of English dominant kids, that linguistic integration works even better. And so that's a real equity tension. Let's say you have enough bilingual teachers to offer 100 dual language seats. If you reserve half of them for English dominant kids to get that linguistic integration, there's a chance that you're also preventing Spanish dominant or Japanese dominant or Russian dominant kids from getting access. Next slide, please. So we tried to measure that. One of the studies that we looked at as we were building our report was from Utah, just as a good confirmation. We have these data. We also have data from North Carolina that do confirm that dual language immersion can foster not just linguistic integration, but also racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic integration as well. So that's a positive good. I think everybody is in favor of school integration in the various research teams that were involved in this. I am as well. But if you look here, you see Utah is a highly white state with not a lot of linguistic diversity. It's the bottom row there. You see almost 3/4 of the students are English. But if you go to are white, and 93% are English dominant at home. If you go up to the row just above that, you see in their 2-way dual language immersion programs, significantly more diverse and more balanced enrollment. So that's encouraging, maybe. Next slide, please. We'll talk more about the different contexts for integration versus colonization in a moment. Here's some other data that we pulled for this report, national data. This is state reported. The top line data is not actually on here, the top line statistic, which is if you look across that top row, you see over 5 million English learner kids. Those are kids who've been deemed by their state to be in the process of learning English, not yet meeting English proficiency under the definition the state has set. So the 5 million English learners across the country, 8% are in dual language, another 9% are in bilingual for a total of 17%. And this is the stat that's missing. That means 83% of English learners in the United States are in English-only education. Now, this is where the equity debate is not particularly nuanced or doesn't need any context. That's just a failure. 83% in English only? it just, that's not keeping up with the opportunity that we have of all the rich linguistic and cultural assets that these kids are bringing to our schools. There's a lot else to pull out of this particular chart. I'll just note that Texas is a real standout in this space, where with over 1 million, about 20% of the English learners in the country, they have roughly 400,000 of those kids enrolled in some form of dual or bilingual education. That's dramatically more than any other state. It's not even close. Next slide, please. So some of the data that we looked at to try to excavate these different tensions was, one, in smaller local communities or in large urban communities, where were English learner shares decreasing as a share of dual language enrollment? Where were white shares of students increasing as a share of dual language enrollment? And you can see here, if you look there, you see New York at the top has 176 dual language schools. 107 of those had a decreasing English learner share from 2015 to 2020. They also, 94 of those had an increasing white enrollment share, meaning majorities of their dual language programs were in those two buckets. If you look at LA, several rows down, same thing. Different cities fall into different categories here. Like in DC, 15 of the 17 dual language programs in the sample had increasing white enrollment share. If you look at Oakland, 10 out of their 12 dual language programs had a decreasing English learner share. I'm not going to belabor this too much, except to point out that this is the jumping off point for trying to figure out when and where the presence and the growing presence of English dominant kids starts to really cause equity issues. If you look at Dallas, Dallas has 154 dual language schools. This is the second highest English learner enrollment district in the country, behind Los Angeles. So it has 44 of those have a decreasing English learner share, so not a majority. 92, a majority, have an increasing white enrollment share. Next slide, please. I submit to you, if you look at Dallas here, you can see in the lower left-hand corner, over 64,000 of their students are English learners, and nearly 45 or over 44,000 of those are in dual immersion. It's their default model for serving English learners in Dallas, independent school district. First of all, the scale of this is just remarkable, right? 44,000 English learners in dual language immersion. The entire enrollment of DC public schools is 45,000 kids. They have more children, more English learners in dual immersion almost than DC has students in its school district. But anyway, if you look at Dallas, you see that it's overwhelmingly Latinx district, right? Something like 75% almost of their students are of Latinx descent. English learners, about 41% are currently English learners. And then another 15 to 30, it's hard to know exactly percent, are former English learners, meaning there's a highly linguistically diverse district with a large percentage of Spanish dominant kids. And remember, we saw that a majority of their dual language schools were getting whiter. 92 out of the 154 were getting whiter from 2015 to 2020. But given that this is a district where demand has more or less been met with the supply that we have for dual language, it's their default model. If you're an English learner, you're in a dual language program. There's a case to be made that the increasing white share, which is likely English dominant share, may be conducing to more linguistic integration in these programs. You want to be careful encouraging that too far, because integration can look like gentrification and colonization very quickly. But given that the white enrollment share here is under 10% of the entire district, it's probably not cause for concern. It might even be a cause for encouragement. Next slide. See the exact opposite or near opposite. One of the other things we found is we looked at the region around DC, which we call the DMV, DC, Maryland, and Virginia. You see, look at the lower left-hand corner here. They have 10,000 more English learners, roughly, in the DMV than Dallas has in the school district. And yet, whereas Dallas had 44,000 English learners in dual language, the DMV has not even 9,000. That means that the default model for serving the English learner in the DMV is English only. And again, that's just bad for these kids. It's bad for any number of studies we've seen on this. The research is very clear. And so in this context, if you look here and you see that English learners, they're the red bars here, you see there's slightly higher share of English learners in the dual language programs as opposed to in the broader region, slightly undersampling for African Americans in dual language compared to the region, oversampling for Latinos and for whites. It's more of a concern here that you have less of a access to dual language and that you have such a high percentage of enrollment for English, purportedly or presumably English dominant kids, because there just aren't as many seats to go around. Next slide, please. Now, as I've said, the context matters a lot. And so if we've got folks on this call from Nashville or from Portland or from San Antonio or from Michigan, like it's going to be, the particular is going to differ a lot on how you can grow your supply of dual language in a way that is facilitating equitable access for English learning kids who, again, stand to benefit the most from these programs, and how you can, when possible, try to conduce towards more integration, linguistic and otherwise. It's just going to vary a lot. But even though context matters that much, we do have a lot of ideas for how you can do work on this federally and at the national level. So one thing that would really help, as we looked across the country for this report, there are so many definitions of what counts as dual language immersion. How to define one way, how to define two way. In Texas, one way immersion means universally Spanish-speaking children enrolled in a bilingual classroom teaching in English and Spanish. In DC, it means universally English-speaking children in a classroom that's teaching in Mandarin and English. There are lots of other ways to look at it. Dual immersion is defined in terms of language allocations, like tons of different models you can use. If the feds would step in and help us get some kind of field clarity, so even if there was still some fuzziness, we could start agreeing on some of the terms we're using, that would be a big step forward. Not dissimilarly, the last bullet on this, it would be great if the federal government took a leadership role in collecting more data on where these programs are. It's surprisingly difficult in many states to define or to find where dual language programs are operating, certainly in K-12, but also and even more so in some cases in the early years. The second bullet point is a recommendation that we've made and will continue to make, and I think it is worth also giving the administration some credit. They have really done a good job of prioritizing growing more bilingual teacher pathways through their national professional development grants that OELA runs, and also through the Augustus Hawkins Centers of Excellence. Next page, or next slide. So the last thing I'd say, and this is the big one, if we could get this first bullet, then we really, I think I could sort of take my ball and go home. This is largely calling for the federal government to reinstate what used to be the Bilingual Education Act grants. Competitive grants that help to grow dual language, in this case, used to be bilingual, but dual language and or bilingual education options all around the country that would seed these, pilot them, and help implement them so that we could grow more dual language in the places where we have the most English learning students enrolled. The OCR could do more on sharpening and clarifying the civil rights guidance that covers English learner students so that our schools know that they really have to be prioritizing language access and equitable access to curricula for these kids. Similarly, in the third bullet, there's, I think, a day is coming when we have to acknowledge that really bilingual and dual are the bare minimum, not just the aspiration, that these are the research-based way to meet the needs of dual language learners and English learners. And so insofar as the federal government can keep on conducting research reviews, pushing toward that day where the evidence continues to mount and they have to keep acknowledging that evidence, that would be a real advantage for the field. Finally, there's a lot of excellent linguistic diversity work and linguistic instruction, multilingual instruction happening in the early years. The more we can do to transition or to align that to the transition into K-3, the better children are going to do. And with that, I'm going to hand it off.
Thank you, Connor. We're going to now talk about the other side of the coin. We want children to have access. We want them in our buildings. And then we want to make sure that once they're in these programs, that we're providing high quality instruction. And that's what we're going to talk about for this section. Remind, please go to the next slide. So these are the two reports that are most relevant to this conversation. We'll put the links to these reports in the chat, and we'll go on to our next slide. As Dr. Meek mentioned, we wanted to think about what does high quality dual language instruction look like starting from birth, right? We know a lot about K-12, but not as much about our youngest children. And we know the importance of providing our youngest learners with opportunities to thrive. And so therefore we were thinking about how can we create a framework that is comprehensive, that would support programs that are either currently implementing programs to improve, but also support programs that are currently English monolingual and want to transition to have a dual language model. We know we can't put all the onus on instruction, so we're thinking about what are some of the core ingredients that start from programmatic level, so things like the leadership team. Oh, I just lost my slide, but I've memorized this framework, so it's not a problem. So thinking like leadership, vision and mission, having policies and procedures that align to the implementation of this vision and mission, our language allocation. So not just saying it's dual language, but how are we intentionally planning for the explicit instruction that allows children to develop bilingually? What does the curriculum, instruction, and pedagogy need to look like for dual language learners in these programs? Workforce credentialing and professional development, assessment, family leadership and engagement, and then services and inclusion for children who are emergent bilinguals with disabilities. And we wanted to really think about what does that look like specifically for infants and toddlers, preschoolers, children in the early elementary grades. And for this framework, we started with Spanish-English dual language programs, recognizing that may vary depending on a community, but we know that 70% of young emergent bilinguals do speak Spanish at home. So we wanted to start there, recognizing that this is really specific to context. And with that, we'll go to our next slide. I'll admit today we're going to do a pretty brief introduction to this framework, but no worries. We have an ongoing webinar. We're going to be diving deeply into each quality dimension starting next month, July 19th. We want you to keep coming back all the way until March. So please mark your calendars. But the way that we came up with this framework is first we started by doing an exhaustive literature review of over 170 articles to really understand what we know and what we don't know across all these quality dimensions. We also conducted an expert convening of over 20 bilingual experts with various roles such as policymaker, district and state educational leaders, educators, and bilingual researchers. And we also did case studies of 10 high-quality dual language immersion programs with spotlights on specific programs that really shined in various ways. With that, we'll go to our next slide. And just to kind of orient us to what this report looks like. We start out with an executive summary, then we think about, we have a core context and concepts that we really want to, we wanted to really highlight the current understanding of bilingualism from an asset-based perspective. And then what you see here is an example of what each quality dimension looks like. So for each dimension, we have an overview. So the elevator pitch around what makes up quality in this dimension, quality indicators that are concrete and measurable, and you can actually see in real life. And then gaps, we do a research synthesis, and then we identify gaps. Of course, there's lots of things we know. And in terms of quality, there's a lot of things that we need to know. And so it helps, for example, researchers know of potential areas for future work. And then we pull out examples of high quality programs related to each dimension of quality. Go to our next slide, please. Like I mentioned before, we're going to take a really deep dive into all these dimensions of quality, but just to give us an overview of like our dream high quality dual language program for our youngest learners. At a high level, we need a leadership with diverse roles who all believe in bilingualism, as research supports that it's more successful to have a dual language program housed in a building where everybody supports dual language immersion versus when it's an isolated classroom and the administrative team may not really understand or know much about bilingualism. We also know the importance of an additive language allocation model. And what that means is that we provide dual language instruction in both languages over time. So the goal is to become bilingual and biliterate rather than something like a transitional bilingual program where you provide some instruction in the home language, but the goal is really just to acquire English. We also want to implement child-centered project-based pedagogy. So all we know that is great for young children, but of course layer that with really intentional instruction to help children make connections across their languages and build what we call metalinguistic awareness, the ability to use language to then learn more language. We also know that language and our identities are crucial. So in a high quality program, children's cultures and identities are strongly represented in materials and instruction. And we know that data is crucial. So data collected at the school level, the program level, and the child level. And then for children specifically, children need to be assessed in English and that second language of instruction so we can track their bilingual development over time. We'll go to our next slide, please. And then additional indicators of quality. We know that the ask to implement high quality dual language instruction is great. And therefore our early childhood workforce needs to understand all the things they already know about child development, but then be specifically trained on how to do that in terms of a dual language model. We also know that teachers need to be well compensated, because one thing that we learned is that teachers who are bilingual have extra work to do. Many times they have to translate materials on their own, and they don't get paid for that extra work and just that cognitive skill to be able to provide the bilingual instruction. And they need to be compensated in order for us to recruit and retain them. We also know that families need to be part of the program community, be given opportunities to have leadership positions, for them to offer their expertise, and then also for the opportunities for them to co-learn with each other in the languages that are most comfortable for them. And last but not least, we know that children with disabilities tend to be doubly excluded, both from dual language education and special education. And we can't have a high quality program if we're not including that population. So a high quality program has procedures for screenings and referrals to early intervention or special education as needed, bilingual therapy support, but also ensuring that children who are emergent bilinguals with disabilities are just included in the same environment as children without disabilities in a dual language setting. So those are just the high levels. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. We'd love to answer them, but for now, we're going to transition over to kind of thinking about, like, now that we hear this research on access and just really broadly about high quality indicators, we want to reintroduce at least one of my favorite people. I know Chantel's as well. Gladys Montes, I know you've done such amazing work at United Way Center for Excellence in Miami. Could you help us think about what some of these indicators look like in real life? If I were just to walk into the doors of the center, what are some of the things that I might see?
Thank you for the opportunity. And again, we're all here because of the passion that we have to deliver a more bilingual, multicultural community, so we all can work together. If you go to a center where, where the focus of the work, it's about creating that bilingual individual, you're going to find that respect for all of the languages that we have in the program. And from when you go in and all of the labeling that happens in the program, as you enter the hallways and you see and you hear teachers talking to the children, and you hear families talking to teachers, it's all in this support of the work that you're doing. When we talk about early childhood education, we're talking about a program that it's based on respect, is based on the responsiveness that we have to children and the nurturing, and all of that cannot happen if we're not respecting the language that we're using in the classrooms. So one of the things that you're going to find is that there are teachers who have been assigned a language. In Miami, we have a great thing that we have a lot of bilingual teachers, but in the center, they have an assigned language that they're going to be utilizing in the classroom. So you might be the English assigned teacher, or you might be the Spanish assigned teacher. And that is all something that is going to start from the time that we hire staff. And we'll talk about that at another time. But it's that intentionality of, servicing a group of children that are going to be working with two languages at the same time. The same thing, with families. You're going to see a lot of materials that are in the different languages that go to the families. But I think the most important thing is allowing the families to be part of that decision making of what is it that they want their children to be, and the connection that we're going to have, that emotional connection that we have to language, and how important it is that the conversations, the instruction, everything happens so the child continues to hear in the school the language from the home as much as they're hearing that other language. And slowly but surely we build the culture that we want to build. Materials, every little nook and cranny in a center, it is going to be intentionally focusing on dealing with more than one language. And newsletters, everything that you find. So again, I think that the thing that really strikes me as very important is that little word of intentionality. Is that intentionality that we're going to have from the beginning to the ending of the program, that we are now maneuvering, working with tools of language, that it's not only the one language. So I think that's important, and people can see it from the time they go in. English all labels in English are in black, and all labels in Spanish are in blue. So even if you do not have the ability of speaking two languages, it's going to strike you as, why is it that there's things in two colors? And it gives you the opportunity to speak to others that, you're entering a bilingual zone. And this is, one of the many strategies that we have in place in order to work with this.
Thank you, Gladys. I really appreciate you saying intentionality. That's a word I always hear you whenever we have conversations. And I think that's such a great segue to our question for Dr. Meek. That idea of intentionality reminds me of quality, but sometimes the conversation either focuses on access and not quality, or quality and not quality. Could you tell us a little bit more about why both access and quality should live together, and what we can do to make sure that we're always thinking about those two things at the same time?
Yeah, of course. And I think this question probably goes to early care and education and education systems more broadly, access and quality to both. But in the context of dual language, I think the points that you've already hit on, CD, the points that Connor hit on before, I'll re-highlight those, right? We know that if we don't protect access, the first folks to lose access are those who are furthest from opportunity already, right? As Connor said, multilingualism for all is fine and great if we had unlimited capacity, if there were unlimited resources, if we had enough slots to go around. Today, we don't. We are very far away from that. So we need to prioritize equitable access, and we need to do that at the front end. This doesn't magically happen. Like, never in the history of the United States has like equity magically happened without intention, and without it being on purpose and like a hard-fought battle. And those are often tough policies that get a lot of pushback, right, at the front end, but really protecting those slots and protecting the access and reserving access. And there's lots of ways to do that we've written about before in previous reports, is key, because if not, we kind of know what happens, because that's what always happens. We know that access for a kid who speaks a different language at home is not the same as access for a kid who is already English dominant in a US English dominant education system, right? That matches their language. One is enrichment, as we already discussed, and one is fundamental access to education, period. Fundamental access to the curriculum, fundamental access to the educator, fundamental access to all of those pieces, right? So I think this concept of targeted universalism is one that we've talked about before in the context of expanding access to high quality early care and education, where ultimately the goal is universal access, but in living and being in a place where we're so far from universal access, right? Folks for who this is the most important, which is kids who speak languages in addition or other than English at home, right, have to get it first, have to be prioritized in terms of where we're placing these programs, in terms of what languages we're choosing, in which communities, and what that's looking like. So that's the access side of the house. And to the quality side of the house, the whole reason why we conceive this whole project this way is because it's access to what, right? As you said, Sigrid, you said it perfectly as you opened, right? Sure, we want them in the school building, in where these programs are, but like, what happens after that? And I think the topic of bilingual education has been such a heated political topic for decades and decades and decades and decades that it is always vulnerable. And we need to ensure that as we're expanding access, we are doing it intentionally and in a really high quality way. Because the minute that we don't get an outcome that we've previously found in research, right, it gets blamed on the fact that it's bilingual, not on the fact that perhaps the instruction wasn't aligned with research, or perhaps the pedagogy wasn't right, or perhaps the materials weren't right, or perhaps the workforce wasn't adequately supported, right? Like, there's all these other indicators, but because of, again, a lot of this racist history and ideologies with language in the United States and the language wars that have been going on, it's just vulnerable to being swooped under as, see, doesn't work, we got to immerse all these kids in English, right? So as we expand, we need to make sure that we're doing it thoughtfully, right? And in a way that takes into account all of these different pieces that we know are important for, in general, positive educational and learning experiences for kids and in particular, right, with that dual language approach, centered on those English learners and kids who are emergent bilinguals in the early years as well.
That's great. It's really important to remember that it's complicated, and we're hoping that some of our reports start that conversation about what do you do to get started. And one thing that I've learned is that we really do need data in order to understand the community, because the programs should reflect the community in terms of the language and the staff that gets hired. And so doing that, not having data, as Dr. Williams shared earlier, it's really such a barrier, because some of the wonderful questions we're getting, we could answer so much better if we had data. And unfortunately, we don't have data. So, or we could build on the data that we have. And so that idea of data interests me, of course, and it's another wonderful segue for Dr. Williams. This is a question that kind of boggles my mind. Help me understand this. So we know from bilingual research that dual language education is the gold standard. So when we're wondering, how do we support dual language learners, immersion bilinguals, we actually have the answer to that, unlike other things where we're not so sure what the answer is. So can you help us understand, what do you think are some roadblocks to access to these dual language programs? And what are some tangible ways that we could work to expand programs in K-12, but ideally really starting from infancy?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first I want to do like the photo negative of mansplaining and just say like everything that Chantel just said. I want to just co-sign all of that and not explain it again. I think she's exactly right. I would also, I mean, there are lots of obstacles you hear about as to why we're not growing dual language. But if you dig under most of them, they're not real. It's, you know, it's too hard, or we don't have the material. Like, most of those can be gotten over. The one that seems to be the stickiest that we do hear a lot, and I think, frankly, there's no clear data on this. We do have a lot of data showing persistent shortages over time is the bilingual teacher shortage, right? So whatever you think about the current state of the more general teacher shortages, which I think there's some reason to believe will loosen quite a bit as the ESSER funds dry up, bilingual teacher shortages are decades old. We have not had enough bilingual teachers to meet demand for years. Certainly here in DC, there's been pressure from the public. There's been pressure from philanthropy. There's been all kinds of enthusiasm. There are thousands of kids on wait lists for dual language in DC all the time. There's lots of interest in growing dual language, and they can't staff the like handful of programs that we have. That's a relatively common situation across the country. And at one level, it's so common that it feels also insurmountable. Well, you know, we know it would work, but it's too hard. The truth of it is that it's just taking the inequities that we were talking about earlier in K-12 and in early ed and leveling them up. Our teacher training systems in the United States are monolingually dominant. They're designed for English dominant, English only teacher candidates to take classes in English, pass tests to become teachers in English, do their training in English. The whole system is designed that way. It's structural bias. And so there are lots of, and this is actually where it becomes, whenever it's structural bias, that's when you pull the policy levers. This isn't something you can sort of mindset your way out of. You just need to shift the structures to make it easier for linguistically diverse candidates to make it through the door. We're actually doing some work on this now. We put out a report back in August on different options for local districts and for states to try to goose their bilingual teacher pathways. How could they grow those fast? But we're going to do more also. I mean, California is ground zero for this. California has a large early care and education system already, right? It's mostly private and it is highly linguistically diverse. The children attending birth to 5 programs in California are extremely likely to be speaking non-English languages at home. I believe it's the majority of the children who attend now. The workforce that works with them is disproportionately likely to speak a non-English language as well. It's a very bilingual workforce. The state is now taking over a lot of those early ed seats, especially in the 4-year-old zone for transitional kindergarten as they grow towards universal pre-K. And the credential requirements they've set up appear to be likely to disproportionately exclude the existing early care and childhood workforce, meaning you're going to have a lot of linguistically diverse candidates who won't have quite the right credential to get into the new public settings. And suddenly we're going to lose all that linguistic diversity in our teaching force, or in their teaching force in California. That's the problem in a really acute state, but we have that everywhere. And the only thing I'll add to that, it's worth, I think, underlining, is that almost all of our structurally biased monolingual English dominant teacher training and licensure system, can only tangentially at best be linked reliably to student outcomes. Almost none of it seemed to be very good at preparing people to teach and controlling for higher quality instruction. And yet we insist on it anyway, even though we know it's reducing teacher diversity and it's not allowing us to grow bilingual education.
That's such a good point. One thing I really enjoyed from conducting the case studies that we did is I got to learn about all the creative things that people are doing on the ground. And I always say that, you know, the field is always at least 10 steps ahead of sometimes what the federal government can do. And so I'll just bring one spotlight. So I don't want to be super negative in this space. Sometimes it feels like we don't know, but there are things that we know. And I want to like uplift that. So there's a wonderful program in North Carolina that it's a preschool dual language program, and they actually provide early childhood training to parents of the program. It's all in Spanish, conducted in the languages that are most comfortable for these families. They provide financial support, and within 3 years of implementation, they've already graduated over 100 parents, and then these parents conduct their internships to become CDA certified in the dual language program. So that's just one example of what can happen when we reduce some of these structural barriers. And language seems to be one of those big barriers to getting a really qualified, strong, and skilled bilingual education for. So thank you for that. And then in the last few minutes before we jump over to a more general Q&A, wanted to go back to Gladys. And I know you've been doing this for so many decades. We're always so inspired by your wonderful work and thinking. And as you're, you know, kind of going in your career, what would you say can be done? Like, can you share your reflections, right, on all the things that you learned while being the administrator of the program in Miami? What do you think, for example, it's going to take to build more programs like the one in Miami and scale them up across the United States?
You know, Sigrid, one of the things, and you were talking about it, you know, before when we're talking about helping families to become CDA teachers and so forth, you know, I think one of the most important things that we need to work on is this education on our families so they can understand, they truly can understand the benefits of bilingualism. You know, the world in which families are moving every single day presents them so many challenges, and at times, especially for immigrants, when they come to this country, they think that what needs to happen immediately is this child needs to learn English so they are not suffering in the way that I am because I do not know the language. So in order for families, because at the end of the day, you know, we always say parents are the children's first teacher. In order for families to and programs to work together, and that we can evolve, and that we can think of the very creative ways in which, you know, have been exposed in the in this webinar about how do we work with everything that is happening around our communities, families need to be an essential part of it, and understand what are the challenges of a bilingual program, but most important, what are the benefits for their children and their community in building this bilingual programs and supporting the programs, because that is going to sort of like reflect in the way when we're hiring teachers. It reflects on the pedagogies that we use in the classroom, on curriculum, on assessments, on everything, because then families are understanding my language is as important as the new language that my children are learning, and there's a respect, there's a way of loving more who we are as speakers of another language other than English, and then helping our children do the transition into the new language. Sometimes, you know, parents have a difficult time understanding, okay, they know now Spanish, and this transition to English, how is this going to happen? And when they go to school, they're going to fail because, you know, all we're doing is speaking Spanish. So all of these is education. We need to do a lot of education to the open community about bilingualism. And I think it's essential too. It's essential to everything that we've talked about and everything that we will be talking about, you know, later. I don't think that there is anything more important than that, because that is going to help us just do everything. These children move from one setting to another. They move from an early childhood setting, then to an elementary school, and then, you know, middle and high school. and having that seed planted and helping parents support this growth, it's going to be very important. And not only that, but remember, our families, our parents then are the individuals that are in the different places in the community. So they're going to start spreading the word. They're going to understand more those assessments and that research that it's happening and those results, so they can kind of bring to the army those that are really not part of, and that they can learn how to understand, what is happening. Another thing is, most of the children that are coming from other countries into the United States, they are not financially well. These are families who are struggling in many different ways, and there's a lot of ideas and opinions that are tied to, and we need to undo all of the bad learning that has happened around this transition into a new culture, this transition into a new language. How do we continue to fight and work for the rights and for our representation everywhere that we go? And it goes into many different ways, not only our regular work, but in our politics and everything that happens around each of these families. So one of the things that we have done a lot in the program is that education. It's from a monolingual English parent that comes in, and it's very curious and wants their child to develop the learning of Spanish, that they understand why do we do it and why is it that it's important.
Thank you for
Excuse me.
I really love what you're saying about, we'd say that bilingualism is an asset, right? I feel like across the early childhood world that I live in, I hear that all the time. Yet we know that young children tend to lose their home language over time because, we can say that something is really positive, but we're not intentional about educating families, or not just educating, but just helping them understand, like, the way that they speak doesn't have to change for their children to be successful. And we know that in certain communities, it's been taboo to speak a language other than English. And so you might have a second, third generation child who doesn't speak the language because the parents don't speak the home language. And I've realized that usually brings a lot of negative and feelings of shame, feelings of not being quote unquote good enough. And I really appreciate what you're saying. It sounded to me like when we empower parents and we educate them, they can also mobilize in the community and then be the ones that dispel the myth. And I think that's really important, especially in communities of color, where those trusted messengers are going to be community insiders. So I really appreciate what you're saying. I think that's really important. We cannot focus just on language as this neutral thing, but remember that language is political, and therefore we have to think about the realities of the country that we're living in, right? And some of the ways in which bilingualism has been contentious politically over many decades, right? And so that relates to, I'll ask this question to Dr. Meek and Dr. Williams and kind of tag team it, if that's okay. But basically, we know that sometimes, right, there are these political ideologies that have been negative around bilingualism. What are some of your recommendations to kind of, elevate what we know is true for bilingualism in places where, honestly, it can be pretty difficult to have those conversations?
Yeah. Oh man, in a 501c3 appropriate way, let me just say, like, it's bad out there. It's really bad out there around some of the politics. What I would recommend is start from just a straight friends of your friends approach, meaning you say, look, if someone who is deeply concerned about linguistic diversity and they find that threatening, you say, look, you just check out the state of Texas. Those guys have been running bilingual ed at large scale for 50 years, and it does not appear to have made them any less conservative or any less anything. Texas is still very much who Texas has been. Look at Utah. Utah, another state where politically you would not assume it would be dual language friendly, but they run a very multiple 200 or 300 dual language programs across the state. North Carolina has a statewide grants program they ran for years that seeded many, many, many dozens of dual language programs around the state. Delaware, this is not just the province of elite cosmopolitan blue cities on the coasts. So that's one, is you say, look, like if you're concerned about this, just notice that other people who may or may not share, but probably share a lot of your political leanings, they're embracing this. And then the other usual approach, I think we have to be very careful about, because it's very much an equality, multilingualism for all kind of an approach, is to talk about things like, monolingualism is the illiteracy of the 21st century, and this is the way to win at business. You need to have another language. National security depends on being able to translate intelligence, all that kind of stuff. I think there's room, depending on your audience, to use some of those kinds of talking points to advance the cause of bilingualism.
I guess I'll just add, living in Arizona, the last remaining English-only state in the nation, with a state superintendent for public instruction that is quite hostile against dual language instruction, specifically for English learners. That, all of the things that Connor mentioned before, I think there are some folks who are very ideologically entrenched, for whom these arguments are not going to matter. But there is usually not a situation where there is only one person that matters that needs to be convinced. There are a whole set of additional folks and entities that need to kind of be on board and really align the policy to the research. And so in the case of Arizona, right, it's district leaders and superintendents who kind of really need this information, as well as the state board for education. There's, the governor and her education advisor. So there's lots of different places where this has to live, even if, right, this one position is never going to be convinced. There are other avenues and other folks who do need this information, and to continue sharing the data for how this works and how the other doesn't work. B, like those other regional examples, look at Texas, look at Utah, right? I think is an important piece. And C, again, like, right, I think we're in this field of dual language and looking at its outcomes, right? They exist across everything. Are you interested in health? Okay, education here, economics and earnings over here, right? Like there's a number of different bodies of literature that we can pull from to tailor that argument for a particular audience. So I think we're coming up on time. I want to hand to Gladys just real quick before I close this out, because she has been absolutely instrumental in Miami, which is in Florida, a pretty politically diverse area, right? And really harnessing support from across the spectrum of different leaders, political, ideological. So I don't know if you have any insights on this question, Gladys, before I close this out.
Well, it's I think that we've said, in many different ways, how important this work is, and how much of a journey it is. It's not easy. And but we need to understand that it doesn't matter if it's that one little person that we need to change, or if it's a whole system that we need to be changing and talking about, the benefits of bilingual education. We need to continue to do it only because our children are families. We owe it to them. We owe for our children to have a better future, and we need to. We know personally. I'm a Puerto Rican person, and I know how important it is for me to maintain my language and to develop the new one, which is the English. So the same thing I want to happen to everybody who's coming to this country. You need to make sure that you keep your language and that you move to the new language. And we need to continue to talk about the benefits of bilingualism. It is not about anything else but that. And I think Connor said it. One is better, two is better than one. And we want our children to come with a plus, because they're coming already with a language, and they learn a new one, rather than them thinking, I am coming with a minus. Nobody knows what I am saying, and this is not important. So to me, planting the seed on children and making sure that they feel valued, and that we continue to assist them and they can grow in the best of the ways, it's a must. I have to do it. I don't have any other alternative.
Well, I'm gonna close us out and just you know, just share, we received funding for this grant a couple years ago now, but this work began a long time before that for everybody on this screen and so many others who came before us, really continuing to push this issue forward. I will say that nearly 10 years ago when I met Gladys, I was working on early childhood policy in the Obama administration, and we published the first federal policy statement on better supporting DLs from the federal level. And we launched that report in Gladys's program. And that's the first time I saw that program, and I was blown away, and I became obsessed then with writing down what she was doing and then scaling it, because why don't all kids have access to this? And so a lot of work has gone in to what we shared today, and you know, the building blocks from today, which is, you know, contributions from lots of folks. And we really hope you'll tune in to the rest of the webinar, where we're going to feature a lot of the folks who partnered with us on these reports. Over a dozen folks came together to really work with us here. So as a final goodbye, thank you to the panelists, Sigrid, for all of her leadership and work over the last couple years on this quality framework and everything else in this space. Connor and his colleagues for building this massive data set, Jonathan in particular, who really did so much work for this, Gladys for her lifetime vision and work, the many scholars who contributed to our thinking, and of course to the school and administrators and kids who allowed us to visit and learn more about their programs. Check out our next webinars in the series that are here on the screen, and you can register using that QR code. So thanks so much for joining us, and have a great week.